Hey friends, welcome to week 10 of Holy Holy. If you're just now joining us for the first time, I would encourage you to go to regenerationnashville.org/holyholy. And there you can find our YouTube playlist. You can find our reading plan that we're following and download that PDF and follow along at your leisure. This week on this podcast, we're going to recap March 4th through 10th, Deuteronomy 1 through 18, Psalm 36, 43, 38, Mark 12 through 16, and Galatians 1 through 2. So let's jump into Deuteronomy. Can you believe that we've made it to the last book of the Torah? I think that that's so exciting. What a great accomplishment. So this right here is Moses' final speeches. It's basically a big, long sermon. And Moses is standing before this new generation of the people of Israel that are getting ready to inherit the promised land. Remember that their parents died in the wilderness because of their faithlessness. And so Moses is exhorting them to be faithful and more faithful than their parents so that they can go into the promised land and obtain all of God's inheritance. So the word Deuteronomy, it comes from the Greek word Deuteronomion, and that means second law. Say that 5 times fast, right? Deuteronomion. And that's because this book has 3 sections. The first section is 1 through 11, and that is Moses' opening speeches. The second section is chapters 12 through 26, and that is another collection of laws. Some of them are new, some of them are old. And so the second law, the second giving of the law, is where we get the word Deuteronomy. And then the third section of the book is chapters 27 through 34. And those are Moses' final speeches and death. So let's jump into the first movement, chapters 1 through 11. Here, we're going to break it down. So chapters 1 through 3 are Moses' summarizing Israel's history. He's saying where we've been, what God has done, because he wants this group to remember. And let me tell you, encourage yourself in the Lord and encourage your friends to share the faith that you guys have, that we have with our children. It's so important that we're raising them up, because just because they're raised with us in the house and they hear things doesn't mean that they have these same experiences. So we want to pull this next generation in and impress upon their hearts the faithfulness and the goodness of God. And that's what Moses is doing with this generation. He's reminding them of the history of Israel, not just their history that they've experienced, but the entire generation that has gone before them, and encouraging them to faithfulness. So he's saying, you're going to go into the land. Your parents couldn't inherit the land because they weren't faithful to God's covenant. So if you'll be faithful to God's covenant, you can inherit the land. And I would even tell you, friend, all that God has for you, he has an inheritance for you. He has a plan for you. So be faithful to God and his word and see what blessings manifest in your life. Deuteronomy chapter 6. So chapters 4 through 11 then are Moses' calls to faithfulness. And in chapter 6, we find one of the most quoted passages of the entire Torah and maybe the whole Bible. And this is verses 4 through 5, and this is called the Shema. You may know it. And it is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. As for you, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." And so the Shema word in Hebrew, in English, it means hear. So hear, O Israel. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. So that's what we're saying. Hear, O Israel. And this word hear, it doesn't just mean like listen, but it means to hear and obey. It's a call to action. Israel, hear and obey the covenant that the Lord our God is one. And this also can be translated that the Lord is, that he is one, he is the only God. He is God alone. The Lord is God alone. And this is important because Israel is coming from polytheism. In Egypt, they had all of these different gods that they serve. And so even as Israel's history will play out, and we'll read it in Chronicles and Kings, that they will begin to serve other gods along with Yahweh. And so God is saying right here, that is not to be so. I am God alone, and you serve me alone, not me with other gods, but only me. And that's really important as the rest of the scriptures play out. So then in the second movement, we find chapters 12 through 26. And this is where we get the book's name. Remember, we've talked about the second law. And this is the second law right here, where Moses is giving some new laws and he's reiterating the old laws. So chapter 12 through 16, this is Israel's worship. We're focused on the worship of Israel, which is the temple. And then also we find this idea of the 10th, to give a 10th of their income to the priest. And then also every 3 years to give a 10th of their income to the poor. This is really a revolutionary idea. The Israelites, through the law of God, are very focused on social justice, on defending the widow and the immigrant and the poor and the orphans. And so they're supposed to save their money, a 10th of it, and then every 3 years give that to the poor. And then we have chapters 16 through 18. This is the second half of that second movement, and this is focused on Israel's leaders. So the leaders of Israel, even the king and such, are going to be subject to the word of God. That means that the king can't come along and suddenly say, hey, I'm God, I'm the embodiment of God. And so now what I say triumphs or trumps the word of God. And we find that in Egypt. Remember, Pharaoh was the embodiment of God. He was considered a deity. And then fast forward, and we find that again in Rome and the Roman Empire. The emperors were considered deities. And so God is setting up Israel in a different way. And he's saying, no, your leaders are subject to the covenant of God. And then God also institutes prophets to work alongside the leadership so that prophets can hold the leadership accountable. So this is supposed to be in tandem. And this really begins with Moses and Aaron. You've got Moses is the leader, and then you've got Aaron is the priest. And so there's supposed to be these two that are going to work in congruency with one another. And this is just to set up the safe falls so that that the word of God is not trumped, that the one guy can't set himself up as God, but remember that the Lord our God is God alone. So let's move on to Psalm 36. I think that this is a beautiful passage. And it says, I'm going to just turn to it really quick. It says, your love, O Lord. Let's see, verse 5. Lord, your faithful love reaches to heaven, your faithfulness to the clouds. Verse 6. Your righteousness is like the highest mountains, your judgment like the deepest sea. Lord, you preserve people and animals. This reminds me, I don't know if you ever knew the group Third Day, but they had a song called Your Love, O Lord, and it said, your love, O Lord, reaches to the heavens. Your faithfulness stretches to the sky. So that is taken right here out of Psalm 36, and it's a psalm about God's faithfulness. Psalm 38, this is where David is feeling wounded and distressed. And I continue to make a point of this with you because I want you to know that if you feel wounded, if you feel distressed, that you have a place in these scriptures, that your wounds, your brokenness, it has a place right here. David constantly told the Lord that he was wounded and he was distressed, but he did it in a way that focused himself on God's faithfulness. So a lot of times we're tempted to say, oh, I'm so wounded, I'm distressed. It must mean that God's not real, that God doesn't hear me, that prayer doesn't work. But that's not how David always centers his feelings. He says, I may feel wounded and distressed, but God is faithful. Verse 15 of 38, it says, for I put my hope in you, Lord. You will answer me, my Lord and my God. God will answer us. Mark, we will talk about Galatians next week, but let's talk about Mark. Mark reveals Jesus as God's servant. Each of the Gospels reveal Jesus in a different way, and Mark aims to reveal Jesus as God's servant. And we see this especially in Mark 10:45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Also, we see how Jesus becomes king, and we see that in the triumphal entry. And then in Mark 15:39, we see the first person to recognize Jesus as who he really was, which is God, and that is the centurion. So friends, keep reading with me. Email me, Jasmine at regenerationnashville.org. I love you so much. God bless.